Sorry about that. The 90s called. They wanted their hair clips back. So as you can clearly see by the title, we are doing Federalist number 10 today. And this is a really important paper. So I thought long and hard about how I wanted to do this and how I wanted to approach this video. As usual, you will be seeing the P1, P2 right here in the corner. So if you'd like to follow along in my explanations, you can do so right here so you know what I'm talking about and where it's located in the paper. If you don't have the papers, I'll also leave a link to the Library of Congress website in the description. They have the entirety of the Federalist Papers on their website, so you can read them there. But if you want a fancy schmancy hard copy like I have, I will leave the link to the edition that I bought to Amazon in the description below as well. I love all the feedback that I'm getting from so many people on the other videos. If you haven't watched my other videos, I do encourage you to go check those out. And also read the comments. There's a lot of you that have a lot of really good information about historical context. You have your own interpretation of the text. I love seeing all of that. But without further ado, let's just get right into it. Federalist number 10 was not written by Alexander Hamilton. It's actually the first one that we see from Mr. James Madison, the namesake of Madison, Wisconsin. If you didn't know, now you know. And the title of this essay is The Same Subject Continued, The Union as a Safeguard Against Domestic Faction and Insurrection. So it's a continuation of Federalist number 9. And this one was published November 22nd, 1787, so one day after Federalist number 9. They were releasing like 3 or 4 a week. Incredible. I don't even write that much in college. So I've done these videos up to this point a couple of different ways. There's some videos where I just give a really brief summary. There's other ones that I have painstakingly gone through every single line. This video is going to be a combination of both. I want to start off first with the summary of this paper because there are so many important ideas in this paper. I don't want any of the ideas to get lost in the explanation of the text. So this paper argues that factions are inevitable, and a faction of people, as described in this paper, is a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole. So it can be 2% of the population, it can be 65% of the population, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest. In past papers, he's talked about the downfall of making decisions based on passions or immediate interests. We tend to lose sight of the big picture. So the solution that the Federalists offer to controlling factions is a republic as opposed to a pure democracy. What a republic is meant to do is to diminish the negative effects of a pure democracy. Well, the problem with a democracy is that it allows the majority to steamroll the minority, regardless of whether or not what they believe is actually just. If that doesn't make sense right now, it will when we start discussing the specific verbiage in the paper. Another benefit of a republic over democracy is that it's scalable, and you can have a very large country with many, many different states that are all fairly represented, as opposed to a democracy where only the majority is really represented. The minority doesn't get much of a voice at all. What it really boils down to is that the type of government that the founding fathers created is to ensure that everybody gets representation. And you would think that it might be a democracy, one where everybody has a vote and casts their vote equally, but they make some really compelling arguments about why that isn't the case. So we're going to take a couple steps back now, and now we're going to actually start looking at the specific verbiage in the paper, starting with paragraph number 1. Very hefty introduction. Factions produce instability, injustice, and confusion into the public councils, and have been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished. And the problem is that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, which are as important as the rights of the majority party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. when you set a society up to only serve the interests of the majority group, whatever it is those interests are, the governments are unstable because they don't have the interests of public good in mind, they have their interests in mind. Publius, which is how we refer to the collective Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, has made the argument up to this point that men who act in their own interests and act only in their own interests and passions tend to be very short-sighted. And the actions that they take and the decisions that they make, is that a song? Usually ends up resulting in conflict. Really, any of the papers up to this point, you can go back and watch those videos, and I explain more in depth how this happens. We already talked about what factions are. So there are two ways that you can cure the mischiefs of factions. The first one is by removing its cause, and the other is by controlling its effects. Now, this first option, removing its cause, would mean that we'd have to remove liberty. So it doesn't make sense to remove liberty because it's the cause of faction, even though faction can also be the downfall of liberty. This is how Madison explains it. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. So fire needs air in order to burn. But you wouldn't abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction. And you also wouldn't wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. So even though factions are the downfall of society and cause so much conflict, you cannot abolish them, because you'd actually have to abolish that which you have spent so much time, energy, and effort protecting, which is liberty. The second expedient is as impracticable as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other. And everybody comes from a very diverse set of circumstances and backgrounds. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results. And from the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the respective proprietors ensues a division of the society into different interests and parties. The fact of the matter is that when everybody has equal opportunity, it does not mean that they will have equal outcomes. You cannot guarantee equal outcomes. Some people will end up having a lot more property than others. Some people will be a much more successful artist than others. Some people will have a better collection of stamps than other people will. Just because we all have the opportunity, equal opportunity to pursue these things doesn't mean that we're going to all pursue the same things equally, and we're going to necessarily, because of this, have different interests. It's a good thing, but it also causes a lot of difference of opinions because people are coming from different backgrounds. Thus, the latent causes of faction are sewn into the nature of man. And a funny little sentence that I found in here, which I think is very applicable to today's issues, a lot of issues. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. So even if we have nothing to fight about, we will find something to fight about. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. This is a very important sentence. We're going to see this theme throughout the entire Federalist Papers, especially when we talk about legislation, especially when we talk about representing the rights of different individuals from different backgrounds. It is the government's job to mediate between these different interests, and in order to do that, it means that the spirit of these different parties and factions are necessary. You need to have representatives of these different and varying interests in order to operate the government. But that in and of itself can cause some issues. If we are to consider that in court, no man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause. If you have to go to court for something, you can't go sit in the judge's chair and make decisions about what should be done in your case, because you'd be biased towards yourself. With equal, nay, with greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. So on cases where we're talking about the interests of the community at large, it wouldn't also then makes sense for that same community to be a judge and a party in their case, because they would be biased to their own interests, not in the interest of justice. So if we allow that to happen, for the people to be both judge and party in their own case, then the most numerous party, or in other words, the most powerful faction, must be expected to prevail. Now that's an issue because, like I said, it's not in the interest of justice. It's in the interest of that party and that party only, which means that the rights of the minority party are completely forgotten. It is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen, in other words, career politicians, will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. We can't expect that some enlightened career politician is going to come in and be able to convince the group as a whole that, hey, we can't do it this way. I know that the majority ruling party right now wants to do it this way, but we can't because it's just not fair for the public good. And everybody goes, oh, okay, I guess we won't do that. It isn't a feasible option. The inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. And the way that the Federalists suggest that we control their effects is by implementing a Republican government. Because under a Republican government, the majority faction, they may be able to clog the administration, they may convulse society, piss a lot of people off, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. So this U.S. Constitution that the Federalists are putting forth and recommending that the United States implement and arguing in support of via the Federalist Papers, even an overbearing majority will not be able to cut through the checks and balances that are in place to protect the rights of everybody and protect the rule of justice. So there's only two ways that we can actually do this. Either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority, having such coexistent passion and interest, must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. But if the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as adequate control. We can't rely simply on people's morality to do the right thing. We have to put fail-safes in place to ensure that the right thing has to be done and that no one major party has the ability to override that. And because the first option of making sure that everybody has the same interests and passions and opinions is just not possible for the reasons already stated before this, the other option is that we have to ensure that they cannot organize in such a way to be able to subvert the rights of the minority. From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. Pure democracy does not protect against factions. A common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by the majority of the whole. There will always be some interests that will be felt by the majority, whether or not those interests are right. And the communication and concert result from the form of government itself. Again, we want to make sure that we don't allow majorities to be able to take over and implement laws just because it serves their own interests. But if you organize in such a way that you have a pure democracy, then you will not be able to avoid that. The government itself will be lending to the majority faction regardless of whether or not the majority faction is doing the right thing. There's nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. If you guys are really interested in understanding the various societies that the founding fathers studied themselves, a really interesting story to look into is the Trial of Socrates. I read this book. I'll link it in the description. This is the cover of it right here. And the Trial of Socrates is an interesting one because he had a different belief about government than the other people in Athens did at the time. Athens was a democracy, and he didn't believe in democracy. He believed in an aristocracy, and they actually put him on trial for corrupting the youth in Athens, and they put him to death by a majority vote of 51%. And you can understand why it's a slippery slope to start putting people to death because of the beliefs that they hold. I may not agree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. It's not Voltaire, but everybody says it's Voltaire, but I don't know who it actually is. Hence, it is such that democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention. Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government, democracy, have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. This is an idea that needs to be repeated today. If a majority faction is sufficiently convinced to vote for something that may not be in their best interest, but could very well be in the interest of the politician who convinced them to vote for it, after it's voted in, it's very difficult to go backwards. So this is why you want to protect against simply allowing anything to go into effect just because the majority votes on it and votes on it to approve it. It doesn't always mean that that vote is in the best interest of the public good, and it doesn't mean that that vote doesn't trample on the rights of a minority faction or party. Therefore, a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. So we're going to examine the ways that it differs from a pure democracy so that we can understand how it offers that cure and the efficacy which it must derive from the union. So the big points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of government, in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. So instead of all of us coming together to vote on everything, we elect representatives to vote in our stead. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. So a republic is scalable, a democracy is not. The effect of the first point, which is that we elect representatives to represent our interests, is that we hope that the people that we elect to represent us are those whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations, though we know that still does happen, that people that are corrupt get into power. But even men of factious tempers, of local prejudices, or of sinister designs, may by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means first obtain the suffrages and then betray the interests of the people. So how do we deal with that then? If we understand human nature, which is that we know that people are sometimes not going to be serving the greater good. So how do we protect against that? In the first place, it is to be remarked that however small the republic may be, the representatives must be raised to a certain number and must be limited to a certain number. So we can't have too many, we can't have too few, which is exactly why representatives in California, for instance, are not exactly proportional to the amount of citizens that we have. I say we because I live in California, as to say a flyover state. They have a higher proportion of representatives to their citizens as compared to California because there's a lot more people here. But that ensures that people even in other states and smaller states still have meaningful representation in the government. The other point of great difference, the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than Democratic government, and it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. So the bigger that the republic is, then the less likely it is that a faction in one part of the country will be able to get big enough to control the rest of the country. Now, this is a question that I want to pose to you, and I'm really interested to see in the comments what you guys say. Do you think that the Founding Fathers sufficiently accounted for how information is disseminated today? I almost feel like there are different factions that aren't formed based on geography as much as it's focused on in the Federalist Papers. Social Dilemma was a really good documentary on Netflix that kind of delved into this, that you kind of go down a rabbit hole. Once you start liking a certain set of posts or a certain type of content, it keeps feeding you more of that content and you end up in an echo chamber. So I wonder if you guys think that the fail-safes that are put in place also protect against factions that aren't necessarily geographic by nature, but are formed through the dissemination of the information itself. Let me know what you guys think. Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over a small republic. The influence of the factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. For example, a religious sect may degenerate into a political faction part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. Now, to answer my own question, I absolutely believe that these principles still apply even when we're talking about factions that aren't geographically created. Honey?
Hi.
We also have to remember that the type of people that spend a lot of time online are different than the type of people that don't spend a lot of time online. Not everybody lives on Twitter or YouTube or Facebook. It's me. I'm people. While we see a lot of people that are very loud and vocal about these other types of governments like socialism and communism and saying that we just haven't done it the right way yet, I don't think that it's enough to be able to pervade the entire country. Some of you might disagree with me. If you do, leave it in the comments. Tell me why. Why do you disagree with me? I have faith in this system, though. I do think that our Republican-style government does have enough fail-safes in place to protect us from improper or wicked projects such as an equal division of property or an abolition of debts. In the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government, and according to the degree of pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans, ought to be our zeal in cherishing the spirit and supporting the character of the Federalists. A Republican is somebody who believes in a Republican-style government. So boom, there you have it. So thank you so much for watching yet another one of my videos. I'm having a lot of fun with these. And you know what? I'm gonna start doing other styles of videos too, like maybe vloggy styles. I wanna show you guys what's on my bookshelf. I'm very proud of my bookshelf, so I wanna show it off. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and like this video. Helps me out a lot. We're getting a lot of new bookworms in our book club, so that's really exciting. That's really cool. If you want to follow me on my other socials as well, I'll put links to everything down below in the description. On Instagram, Boring Book Club YT. On Twitter, Boring Book Club. Facebook, Boring Book Club. I said Twitter. That's all today, folks. Bye.